It's good to see our friends here again this morning. Some of us have been under the weather. We still have one of our prayer team sick. We're going to pray for her this morning, and hope you are praying there. It's Wednesday, and Wednesday we devote to praying and seeking God, living in an attitude of prayer, and we're learning lessons from the life of David. Isn't it great that we can learn lessons in life? Amen. And sometimes we learn lessons from the good things people do. Sometimes we learn lessons from the bad things people do. And unfortunately, King Saul, is an example of bad things. But we can learn from the bad things he does. And today we're going to learn another lesson from something he does wrong. And this is something we should never, ever do. Never do this. God hates it. Never do this. And when I see people do it, it really bothers me. It really bothers me. But listen to what happens in 1 Samuel 23:7. Remember, Saul is trying to kill David. David's anointed by God. David's the one who's eventually going to become king. Saul is jealous, and the jealous is controlling him. It's become demonic, and he wants to kill God's anointed. And then there's this amazing verse in 1 Samuel 23, verse 7. It says this: Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and Saul said, God has handed him over to me, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars. What is amazing is that Saul actually says, God has handed him over to me. He's using God's name to justify what he's about to do. And God hates that. Saul has not inquired of the Lord. In the same chapter 23, it says twice that David inquired of the Lord. Verse 2, David inquired of the Lord. Verse 4, once again, David inquired of the Lord, and God told him to go to this town in Keilah. But Saul never inquires of the Lord, but he uses God's name to justify what he's about to do. And God never told him to do that. God never told him to kill David. God never told him to do any of these things. He's doing it demonically of his own will, and he's putting God in the mix. And I see people do that all the time. Christian people, and it bothers me every time I see it. They say, God has told me to do this. And then 2 weeks later, God has told me to do something completely different. God does not change his mind. God speaks to you, and that's it. Now you do it, even if he never speaks to you again. But God doesn't tell you to do one thing, and then next week tell you, no, don't do that anymore. I changed my mind, do this. Or people, to justify their own actions, say, this is what God led me to do. Even people leaving ministry, they say, oh, God is leading me to leave or to do this. I've heard people even breaking up with other people. They put God in the mix. Now, God gives us the opportunity to make decisions in our life. Like I decided I was going to wear a sweater today. I didn't have to seek God to put on a sweater or what I wear. And just basic decisions in life we can make without God. He gives us the ability to make choices and to do things. And I don't have to say, well, God told me to wear a sweater today. That's why I'm wearing a sweater. God gives us the ability to make choices. But sometimes God does speak to us. And when God speaks to us, and we know he's spoken to us, then we can say, God told me to do this. But when we start to say, God told me to do this, and he really didn't tell us, that is actually a violation of one of the 10 commandments. Commandment number 4. The big 10. When we use God's name in vain. In Exodus 20, verse 7, it says, "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. For the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name." That's very serious. He's not going to hold anybody guiltless who misuses his name. So that tells me I better be very careful when I start saying, "God told me this." Or I've been in churches where pastors will tell people, "God told me to do, you have to do this in your life." It better be God. Amen. Or you're in a lot of trouble. Amen. When my wife, Pastor Daisy, first became a follower of Jesus, she was in a church and a woman, and she had her children, and she had a woman came who was a prophetess. And she said, "God told me to tell you, you have to go to Africa as a missionary and leave your kids here." That's serious. God hates that. And he's not going to hold anyone guiltless who uses his name in vain. We have, brothers and sisters, we have to be very careful. It becomes like a Christian thing to do. "Oh, God told me. Oh, God told me." We have to be very careful what we say, how we use God's name. We have to be sure, God told me this, and then you do it. And sometimes God tells you something, but he doesn't tell you to tell anybody about it. That happened to me not too long ago. God told me they were praying for somebody to be healed, and just out of the blue, God said to me, "Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it bears no fruit. If it dies and falls to the ground, it will bear much fruit." And I knew immediately this person was not going to be healed. They were going to die, but their death was going to glorify God. I told my wife 6 months later, that's what happened. I never told anybody else about it, because God didn't tell me to tell anybody. So please be very, very careful not to just throw God's name in. People do it in an argument to give them some kind of power so that people will listen to them. It's dangerous. Saul, of all people, who was demon-possessed, who was trying to kill God's anointed, used God's name to justify his going to kill King David. Wow. That's using God's name in vain. And God will not hold anyone guiltless who uses his name in vain. So that's our lesson for today. Be very respectful of God's name. Honor God's name. Don't use it as a curse word. Don't use it just to justify what you do, but we should have a reverence for God's name, an honor. I mean, the Jewish people don't even say his name. They say the name instead of saying his name. We have to have a reverence for God. And so that's the lesson we have from our bad example, King Saul. And tomorrow we continue with the devotionals with a good example from King David. So if you need a prayer, click the link below and put in a prayer request, or just put a comment, and we'll be happy to pray for you today. Today we're going to focus on praying for people who are sick, praying for the church to grow and expand, and new people to come to Christ. So this is Pastor Willie. God bless you, and have a great time praying today.